Hello, everyone. I used to live in New Zealand, where I worked on human rights issues, and I traveled quite a bit. On one occasion, I returned from overseas, and I walked back into our kitchen, and there our son, Robbie, was playing with a friend of his. They were both about 6 years of age. So Robert and I warmly greeted each other, and then he and his friend resumed their play. Then I heard the friend say to Rob, what does your dad do? And Rob replied, he travels around the world doing good. And then there was a pause and a deep, rather theatrical sigh. And he said, but it never works. And what he meant was that I had to keep going back, right? So evidently I hadn't fixed it the first time. Well, actually, Rob had put his finger on a really important set of questions. Do human rights work? If human rights work, how do we know that they work? We've tended to rely on more of the moral and political and legal arguments in favor of human rights, but not so much the evidential arguments that human rights actually save lives, reduce suffering, and empower individuals and communities. And in my view, if we want human rights to speak to policymakers and practitioners, then we need evidence that they work. Rob's wistful observation, Dad's human rights work perhaps doesn't really work, it raises another fundamental question. What do we mean by human rights? For some years, I worked on civil and political rights. The classic prohibition against torture, the right to a fair trial, freedom of expression. And I conducted cases in the courts in Europe, and I worked on these issues in the Middle East as well. But then an extraordinary opportunity came along. And for a couple of years, I had the great privilege to live in West Africa, in the Gambia, and work for the Africa Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies. This was in the 1990s. And here I am, I think, showing my age now, on my air-conditioned bike, leaving the Africa Center, and here shaking hands with President Jawara, who was the first president of the Gambia. And I'm accompanied by Mr. Raymond Sock. He was the center's director, now a very eminent Gambian jurist. In any event, working in the Gambia changed my life in several ways. I learned that civil and political rights are exceedingly important, but just as important is a cluster of other rights that I had been completely blind to. For example, the right to basic education, basic shelter, basic healthcare. And my African friends, my African colleagues, were not only driven by a concern for civil and political rights, they were also animated by a deep concern for these other rights. And in the Gambia, I realized that I had been viewing human rights with one hand over one eye. I had been looking at only half of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, only half of the International Human Rights Treaties, only half of what we all really need for a decent, dignified life. But regrettably, I was not alone. The great majority of human rights workers were only seeing half of the human rights picture. So I began to dig. I began to research. I began to study these other human rights, and I found they had deep roots in all cultures, not just in Africa. In the West, for example, their roots can be traced back to the American Revolution, to the French Revolution. Tom Paine was one of the great thinkers of those tumultuous times, and his book, The Rights of Man, caused a public sensation. It was literally a bestseller. As I dug and as I read, I found that Paine's Rights of Man had two parts. Part one advocates what are effectively civil and political rights. Unfortunately, most of us stop reading at the end of part one. This is a great pity. Keep reading, because part two of the Rights of Man advocates something very close to the other rights that I had to go to the Gambia to learn about. For example, very briefly, in the second part of the Rights of Man, Paine advocates a system for educating the children of the poor. And he emphasizes that what he envisages is not charity, he says, but a right. Let me fast forward 150 years to President Roosevelt. FDR championed what he called the four freedoms, one of which was freedom from want. Eleanor Roosevelt steered the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the United Nations with great skill. FDR, Eleanor Roosevelt, and most Western countries grasped that deep deprivation, profound inequalities, contributed to the growth of fascism in the 1930s. And in the 1940s, they realized that securing these other rights, education, shelter, healthcare, might possibly stop history repeating itself. Have we forgotten that lesson? Fascist-like authoritarianism comes in many secular and religious forms, and they don't spring from nowhere. To return to my story, just a few years after the Second World War, Martin Luther King Jr. understood the importance of these other rights. He knew the elimination of inequality needed more than civil and political rights. He said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And just last year, President Barack Obama emphasized regular access to a doctor or medicine or preventive care. That's not some earned privilege, it's a right. That's the language of Tom Paine. And as I dug deeper, it became clear that almost everyone who had called for these other rights shared a common idea. And this idea is as powerful and vital today as ever. They all shared a vision of meaningful equality. They were not only talking about formal equality, that is, equality before the law, although that's hugely important. They were also talking about equality so the disadvantaged enjoy the same life chances as everyone else. And this is what the other rights are about: meaningful equality for all. These other rights are really equality rights. During my digging, during my research, I wrote a book called Reclaiming Social Rights. That's what human rights law calls these rights, social rights. But I might have called the book Reclaiming the Other Rights or Reclaiming Equality Rights. And as we all know, in many countries, there is no meaningful equality between rich and poor, between one ethnic group and another, between men and women, people with and without disabilities, and between some other social groups. I won't try to list them all. Billions of people do not enjoy equal life chances, and the majority of them are women and girls. The rights to education, to shelter, healthcare, and other equality rights aim to provide, as far as possible, the same life chances for all. Some say these rights are not realistic. I strongly disagree. Of course, a government cannot build an education system overnight. It takes money, it takes time. But the right to education recognizes that. It allows a government to build an inclusive, quality education system over a period of time. That's what the right to education says. But the right to education requires that the government be held accountable for its progress, or perhaps for its lack of progress. It seems to me that's realistic, isn't it? So, what do we mean by human rights? Of course, we mean civil and political rights, but in addition, we mean the other rights, equality rights, such as the rights to basic education, shelter, and healthcare. But still, I've got Robert's question. Do human rights work? Do equality rights work? So here, others will speak, and you decide for yourselves. For many years, Peru has suffered from a very high maternal mortality rate, especially among indigenous women. There is now a range of measures to reduce maternal mortality in Peru. And to some degree, these measures are working. Fewer women are dying in childbirth. Of course, there's still a long way to go. Phil Borges has made a film about a maternal health initiative in Peru. It's organized by CARE. And this initiative has several elements, all explicitly shaped by health rights. So here is a very short clip from Phil's beautifully shot film about just one part of the CARE initiative.
Eugenia raises llamas and sheep on the high plains of southern Peru. Like most Quechua women, she gave birth to her 3 children at home. She just didn't see any benefit to going into the local health post. 3 years ago, she began training with CARE to become a citizen monitor, or what they call a vigilante. 1 day a week, she rides 6 miles to the health post to volunteer her services. Her presence builds the trust between the healthcare providers and their clients. That trust is the key to the extraordinary improvement that has taken place in Peru's maternal health program.
At first, the women did not trust the health post. The doctors did not speak our language or honor our traditional methods of birthing. I asked the women, do you trust the treatment you are getting? Does the doctor speak Quechua? Do they treat you with respect?
The suggestions and complaints that Eugenia and other vigilantes gather help create the understanding of the Quechua views and traditions. Their findings are then sent to Peru's health ministry to be addressed.
For me, it was very important to learn about my rights in the trainings. It meant that women didn't have to limit ourselves to the home. We could go out and have responsibilities with groups. We could go and speak with authorities about what we need and want. This has given me strength.
What a brilliant strategy. An army of volunteer women. Women empowered just by learning their rights and getting a forum to share their insights. They are now bridging the cultural divide that had kept women from seeking and obtaining the health care that they were entitled to.
Let's leave the Sierra and travel down to Lima on the coast. Earlier this year, I visited some governmental, that is public, health facilities in a favela in East Lima. Here I met the inspirational Dr. Luis Fuentes, and he and his colleagues explained how they use health rights in their work. And here is a very, very short extract from a recent interview with Dr. Fuentes, with many thanks to Agustin Diaz.
La esencia del derecho a la salud está en considerar al otro como una persona. Lo que estamos haciendo en esta parte de Lima Este es acciones de salud con el pleno consentimiento y participación de los ciudadanos. Hemos mejorado la disponibilidad de servicios, mayor cantidad de recursos humanos, profesionales y técnicos capacitados, la asequibilidad, el tema económico a través del aseguramiento universal, la adaptabilidad cultural a través de estos intérpretes quechohablantes, la plena participación de la comunidad y del gobierno local corporativo. Para nosotros los derechos humanos inclusive van en los extremos, en las personas que han perdido su libertad, porque han perdido su libertad pero no su derecho a vivir. Y hemos conseguido en virtud de esto hacer abogacía para que las condiciones de los que brindan atención dentro de los penales y las personas afectadas estén en mejores condiciones para ver el tema de tuberculosis. En salud nosotros debemos velar porque la vida de todos los ciudadanos sea considerada como digna.
Dr. Fuentes mentioned their use of interpreters, and here's a diminutive Quechua woman and her interpreter in one of the health facilities. Unfortunately, as you can see, I think we're rather terrifying her. To leave Peru, however, the power of these equality rights extends to high-income countries like the United Kingdom. In Northern Ireland, as some of you might know, there's a terrific organization called the Participation and Practice of Rights. And PPR runs a number of projects that are driven by equality rights. And one project concerns 7 high-rise blocks of flats in Belfast. They're called the Seven Towers, which sounds something like something from the Lord of the Rings, and certainly not from the Shire. But here, some of the residents talk about their human rights campaign for improvements to the 7 towers.
In order to judge if the Housing Executive were meeting our rights, we decided to monitor if things got better or worse for residents over 12 months. In order to ensure real participation, i.e. that residents were deciding how our rights could be made real, we chose the issues we wanted to see improvement on. The issues we want to plan to monitor are as follows: pigeon waste, families in the 7 towers, dampness and mould, drainage and sewage problems, resident satisfaction of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive's response to maintenance problems, participation and involvement of residents in decisions made about their housing. In May of this year, following the survey, the Northern Ireland Housing Executive informed the local housing forum that they plan to do a major renovation of the flats, which they say will deal with many of the issues listed above.
Today we met up with Margaret Ritchie, the new Housing Minister, and she herself today committed to helping us, the 7 Towers residents, with our indicators.
The hearing received wide coverage in the local and national media. On the 3rd of July, in response to the hearing, the current Minister with responsibility for housing, Ms Margaret Ritchie, visited the residents in the New Lodge to receive a presentation on their work. In addition to commending the work of the residents, the Minister made a commitment to ensure that the Housing Executive tackle the issues in accordance with the human rights indicators and the benchmarks set by the residents.
I could give you hundreds of examples from all corners of the world. Of course, these short clips aren't, in quotes, scientific, but they tell a really important human rights story. And that story is about care and compassion, it's about decency and dignity, it's about agency and accountability, it's about participation and empowerment. Data, numbers, have a vital role to play, but they cannot tell the whole human rights story. The World Health Organization recently published a book which looks at the impact of human rights on women's and children's health. This research was led by WHO Assistant Director General Dr. Flavia Bustreo and myself. The book has over 30 co-authors from many countries. It demonstrates that human rights contribute to health gains for women and children. And it concludes that we urgently need more research on human rights impact. The book sets out ways to conduct this multidisciplinary research. Ladies and gentlemen, a global movement is gathering pace. It's empowering, it's exciting, it's diverse, and as we've seen, it already reaches into the mountains and the favela and into other disadvantaged communities. And at the heart of this movement are the other rights, social rights, equality rights. And while this movement gains inspiration from the past, it must be forward-looking. It must use the opportunities provided by information technology, social media, big data. The other rights, social rights, equality rights, they signpost the less traveled road to greater equality. What Robert will make of this afternoon's work, well, we'll have to wait and see. Thank you very much.